In many democracies all around the world, a seemingly unstoppable rise of far-right populism has been observed in recent years. Along with this, anti-democratic views are being expressed more and more blatantly in public. They are also spreading among the population, as we have just recently seen with the radicalization of protests against the present government and its members in Germany. Crossing racist, anti-Semitic, anti-Muslim, and ethno-nationalist boundaries is part of the political basics of right-wing populist actors. These taboos, in fact, win them votes. One of their targets, if not the target par excellence, is migrants who are constantly defamed by parties like the AfD, the Alternative for Germany, as freeloaders and criminals. In order to counter far-right populism, we as researchers and as democratic citizens must examine these discursive dynamics of uncertainty and mistrust more closely. What is the strategy behind such populist outbursts? How do increasing uncertainty and the loss of trust affect the population, not least in terms of their voting behavior? And what role does the media play when it comes to confronting right-wing populism? In today's episode of our ConTrust podcast on trust and conflict, we will reflect on these questions and the problem of right-wing populist politics in general, with a particular focus on the topic of terrorist attacks. How are these attacks used for the purposes of the far right? What can we learn from this to stop the rise not only of right-wing populist voices, but also of mistrust corroding the foundations of our democratic societies? To discuss these questions, we have invited another great guest today. In our episodes so far, we've had two political philosophers who have been talking to us about their research on trust and conflict. Today, we have somebody from a very different profession, namely the realm of economics. Guido Friebel is a professor of human resources here at Goethe University in Frankfurt. His main research field is organizational and personnel economics. Among the research that he does are studies through randomized controlled trials with and within firms, with a view to increase both productivity and worker welfare and to test important theories. He also analyzes observational career and promotion data and writes models about careers, communication, and talent management. Aside from that, Guido has considerable interest in the impact of institutions, which is not the same for all economists, namely how institutions shape the accumulation and allocation of human capital, focusing on problems of families, gender, and migration. And this already tells us that he is not just interested in economic problems and questions narrowly understood, and we will hear more about that in today's episode. But before we get started with this, let me conclude his introduction by naming some important positions that Guido holds. He is the president of the Society for Institutional and Organizational Economics, a founding member of the Organizational Economics Committee of the German Economic Association, and a member of the Scientific Advisory Board of Sciences Po. And not the least, he is a principal investigator at ConTrust, where both of us work in the working group on economic exchange. Guido, thank you so much for joining us today to talk about your research. But before we get to the specific study we want to focus on today, I would like to ask you more generally, as an economist, how do you look at the agenda of ConTrust, that is the interaction between trust and conflict? Is this a relation that is of particular importance in economics? Where do you see its relevance from an economics perspective? And how are you personally, with your research agenda, invested in these overall themes of trust and conflict?
Thanks a lot for having me. It's a great initiative, and I'm very happy to talk about my research and in general advertise ConTrust, which is a fantastic group of researchers. Indeed, many economists might not look as much into institutional mechanisms as we should. I think there's a good movement towards understanding that institutions shape mechanisms, beliefs change mechanisms, and that the way people communicate are very important for economic outcomes. Now, what we do in the group that I'm invested in is to think about micro mechanisms that create trust in different realms of society, in families, in organizations, in specific policy areas. And of course, migration is one of these areas that I guess we are interested in. We see that The beliefs have changed in society about the costs and benefits of migration. I think this is something that's very important. And we also know that many institutions, broadly defined, not just formal institutions, but also norms, beliefs, and so on, are very important to understand how trust can be created through useful interactions in conflict, and how we need to be very careful in not having conflict spiraling out of control in different places in society.
I mean, that's already a fascinating answer, I think, because it tells our listeners that economists don't just deal with markets and economic exchanges, strictly speaking. And the same goes for the study that we want to focus on today. It's a study that you did with Marius Liebald and Navid Sabet. And it investigates the link between terrorist attacks and voting patterns, especially with regard to how terrorism is linked to electoral gains by the AfD. So by now there's a wide variety of studies from different disciplines on the rise of far-right populism, and it is evident that there's not just one cause for this rise. Now, Guido, with this in mind, please briefly describe the particular correlation that you have investigated with your collaborators, and what is the independent and the dependent variable in your approach, and what prompted you to carry out this study in the first place, and where do you see its relevance?
Yeah, that's a great question. We should always ask why we do the research we do. And I've been interested in migration for a long period in time. I don't even know why, actually. I think the link has been that these human capital, as we call it, human capital decisions of people, they're very important. People decide to found a career, a family. They decide to move from one place to another. And all of these things are very important for economic outcomes. Now, increasingly, we are looking at the problem of migration as a problem that polarizes society. And it would be foolish to believe that we can just have a debate on the economic gains of migration without taking into account the political constraints to this. So we need to understand these political constraints, and they become more and more evident, I guess. How did we get to this point? In many social sciences, I think we know a lot about the multi-causal, as you were putting it, relationship between migration, right-wing activism, political outcomes, and how, in particular, right-wing politicians appeal to very basic things in people to reach their political goal. And we also know that other groups in society use terrorism to reach their goals. So we started from a very agnostic point of view by saying there was a very interesting data set that would allow us, in our belief, to identify the causal impact of terrorism on vote outcomes. To make that very clear, suppose we are comparing a place that has been subjected to a terrorist attack to a place that has not. And we would say, oh, look, in this place, the right-wing party has gained 5 points, say, in the election compared to the place that has not. If we do that, then we do not take into account the selection bias, as we call it in economics. So it's likely that the place that was victim of a terrorist attack is not entirely comparable to the place that has been the victim of a terrorist attack. We know, for instance, that terrorist attacks are more likely in cities than in the countryside, that maybe socioeconomic stratification and so on has an impact on this and so on. So what we want is a causal estimate of this. What do? We take an international data set that lists all terrorist attacks in Germany and differentiates terrorist attacks that succeeded and terrorist attacks that failed. What is failure and success? Suppose somebody throws a Molotov cocktail into a house and people are lucky and it doesn't go off. Then nobody is hurt. But suppose now people are unlucky and the terrorist attack succeeds and people die. So that's the very precise, if you wish, experiment we use to have a causal a causal inquiry on the effects of terror. So we are comparing those with econometric techniques, and we wonder how the fact that a terrorist attack succeeded rather than failed affects the vote shares of different parties, in particular of the extremist party, and here in particular of the AfD.
And so this study reveals, among other things, one particularly astonishing, almost paradoxical result then, which is about the effects that right-wing extremist attacks targeting foreigners have on the political attitudes and voting behavior of the broader population. So could you please explain to us what observations you were able to make in this context? First of all, I would like to know what you found out and whether you and your colleagues were surprised by these findings. We will then discuss the explanations for the phenomenon afterwards. But maybe, fill us in on the results.
Yeah, we were indeed surprised to see that, first of all, maybe not that surprised, to see that much of the terrorist attacks comes from right-leaning people against foreigners. There's much less that goes into the other direction. Now one needs to be a little bit careful. The mega events that were terrible, that terrified society, are not in that sample. The really big terrorist events that we had, like on the Christmas market in Berlin or so, is not in that sample. But that's the first fact. The second fact is that if a right-wing attack occurs, what you might expect is that people become more aware that right-wing extremism is dangerous and that they might rather vote for centrist parties or, more democratic parties. This is not the case. What we find is that in these areas where a terrorist attack was successful compared to one that failed, you actually get an increase in AfD votes. And it's quite substantial. It's a few percentage points. And it's a time where the AfD was rising. And we see it particularly on state elections. We don't see it so much in national elections or European elections. We see it on the level of the state, of the Land, of the Bundesland. And we have an explanation. So we recently did a survey to find out whether people actually know that issues of police, but also of the distribution of migrants within a land are a federal thing, a European thing, or a Ländersache. We find they do know. So somehow people in these affected areas, they attribute terrorism to we have too much migration, and some politicians are responsible for it. So rather than saying we have too much right-wing extremists, they seem to make the conclusion migration is a particular problem. And we also see reactions in the political platforms. So the AfD, for instance, pushes this fear of migration much more intensively in elections that are relevant for them and seems to score by doing so.
Let's come back to that question in just a moment, because that's already part of the explanation. I was just wondering, since you were talking about the different scales where that seems to matter on the various elections, I was wondering about the municipal level, if there's any findings related to that, because you would think, these are very precise locations where these things happen, and it might have something to do with sort of the situation on the ground, one might think.
That is a great question. Those data, unfortunately, we don't have.
Okay.
But that's an excellent question. Let me say, I think we would find the same thing. Because, and here's part of the story, it's salient. The question is, where is the level of salience in the story? And probably if you go lower, you might see even more. Now, municipal elections or Länder elections might also be a slightly cheaper way of signaling something than a federal election.
Because it's typically second-order elections, as
it's a second-order election, exactly, exactly. And it might be in between two federal elections, and then you want to signal something. There's some evidence that people do so. But we were really interested by the finding that people seem to know quite a lot about the division of labor within the executive and who is responsible for what they see as a problem, i.e. too much migration in their place.
Mm. So violent attacks by right-wing extremist actors, especially on foreigners, seem to be grist on the mill of right-wing extremist parties like the AfD. So let us now turn to that critical question, which is why exactly this is the case. Of course, you're not a social psychologist, and it's impossible to look into people's heads anyway, but perhaps maybe some informed ideas of how do we explain this almost paradoxical result that you have there. It's rather counterintuitive at the very least.
Absolutely, almost paradoxical, but at least counterintuitive. I totally agree. What helps here is that Germany has a beautiful data set called the Socioeconomic Panel.
Well, one thing that works in Germany, I guess.
And that is we're the worldwide leader in the Socioeconomic Panel. In Germany is the best Socioeconomic Panel in the world.
Let's note that.
Let's note that. It's a fantastic data set that has been developed in collaboration between sociologists, political scientists, and economists, and it helps us a lot to see what opinions people have. And if we go into these areas that have been treated by a successful attack rather than by a failed attack, we actually see that people become politically more active. And that's also one of the margins we see. I mean, a lot of the additional AfD vote comes from people who usually don't vote. So it seems that these people interpreting the fact that there is a violent act might show that they believe there's too much migration, also believe that they should go to vote. That's the first interesting thing. And in general, they indeed become more concerned about migration again. So we measure this and also see it in the Socioeconomic Panel that they become more concerned about these things. So the trigger is I do something very bad against foreigners, and then people become more aware of a problem. And somehow they attribute the problem to the victims rather than to the people who do the act. Indeed paradoxical.
Yeah, but it's almost mind-boggling, and I guess that brings us to the natural follow-up question: how this ends up happening, and I guess that sort of naturally leads us into the realm of the media and the effects that media coverage might have on that. So what were your results in this regard? How does reporting on right-wing terrorism influence people's perceptions, and how do tone, content, and media narrative influence us? And would you say that the media is partly to blame for the rise of far-right parties? We can say that we're not politicians.
Yeah, I would probably not say they're to blame, but there's definitely more reporting about, again, sorry for that word, successful attack than a failed attack. And indeed, the words migration and so on appear quite a bit. I have one explanation. So one explanation would be, first of all, I need to be careful because we don't look at all the media. We were only able to look at a subset of newspapers. It's much harder to do this analysis for radio broadcasts or TV broadcasts and so on. So we have a really narrow subset. And it's also understandable that media would talk more about a successful attack than about a failed attack. But they seem to be relatively conservative about saying who committed the act. So I think what's going on is that journalists might be very careful about blaming somebody before it's not clear who is to be blamed. And that is probably dangerous. We should probably, as journalists, inform people about even who is likely to be blamed. If, for instance, you have evidence that this is a neo-Nazi organization or you have a letter or something, you should make very clear who has done it and to explain to the population who are the victims and who are the criminals, and make that very clear. Is this deliberately so? I wouldn't say. It's probably in the dynamic of what reporters do. A successful attack gives you more attention, and you might want to be very careful in blaming it before you're not sure. And one thing that I think that you could do is we need probably to ask journalists to look at problems in a more long-term perspective, to give more background stories and more investigative journalism, and not the very quick and short and salient reports on things that people care about.
That's a difficult suggestion in a profit-driven enterprise, of course,
for sure,
as most media are. But I think it's important also to take note of what you said about sort of the restrictions of your inquiry, which is you have a fairly small segment of the media, really.
That's right.
And we know that especially in right-wing milieus, there are other channels that play a huge role, of course. But nevertheless, you know, that's still an important finding that you're sharing.
They might not even read these newspapers, right? But there might be people who are on, well, like swing voters and who are swimming between not voting. And if they vote for extremist parties, and they might read it.
Right. And they might be the crucial ones.
And they might be the 2 or 3 points that you gain. Yes.
Those who haven't voted before and were, you know, maybe even unaligned or something, right? So the research you're discussing with us today is not explicitly about trust, but nevertheless, the dynamics of trust and mistrust are crucial if we want to understand the highly complex connection between terrorism and right-wing populism. Violent terrorist attacks from right-wing extremists aim to create insecurity, which is ultimately intended to lead to social and political destabilization. Even though it is individuals who suffer these attacks, they really target the general public. Against this background, my question is it correct to say that parties like the AfD thrive on mistrust and a sense of insecurity?
I think that is precisely what we observe in the way right-wing parties speak. I think there's a very dangerous combination of mistrust in institutions, here in governmental institutions, institutions of civil society, and this way of self-victimization. I find that extremely interesting, that you very often have this rhetoric that we, the majority, are a victim of incompetent politicians and migrants. And we become victims, we have to defend ourselves. And that's a rhetoric that seems to work very well. And to that extent, giving people this sort of trigger, even by a violent act, to see, look, we have migrants in this village, and somebody should do something against it, is a very explosive cocktail, undermining trust and using this violent conflict or these violent acts for very simple goals.
But at the same time, I mean, part of the offer of a party like the AfD, for example, would be to say, but trust us because we'll deal with the problem, right? So it's not sort of a generalized trust that's almost like an anomic condition, but it's more about shifting trust from the established institutions and parties and organizations to the outsider who claims, you know, very authentically that they'll be on your side and so on. Is that how it works?
And in particular, they offer very simple solutions, because a simple solution would be to send everybody home. And then there would not be any problem, which of course is totally infeasible, as we know. Has the AfD been able to show that they can be trusted? No, they haven't been in government. Would they manage the situation better in one or another way? People give them actually maybe the doubt of trust. You know, it's a little bit like, oh, why not try something else if you're very, quote unquote, unhappy about what you have? And that's precisely, I guess, where violent acts come in.
Mm-hmm. And in a way, I guess that brings us already to our concluding question. Because, I mean, one conclusion that could be drawn from what you were saying is that, you know, this trust has never been tested. And of course, you know, the obvious option then would be to, well, you know, have them govern something, and see if they can deliver on these promises. Of course, that's a very controversial debate that we're having these days. I
wouldn't want to run that experiment.
I don't think it's going to be your conclusion, but nevertheless, I mean, the question is, what is to be done? Because, I mean, one way of describing what you found out with your collaborators in that study is that it's really a self-reinforcing politics of fear of right-wing authoritarian movements that seems to have a vicious circle on their side. As it were, by generating mistrust and hatred, they more or less willingly contribute to rising politically motivated violence, which in turn drives more and more of the population towards them. And so based on the research that you've done, how do you break that vicious circle?
That is an excellent point. If I knew, of course, maybe I should run this country, which nobody asked me so far. No, but I think what is very important is that people should have all the information that helps them to understand whether there is a real threat and whether that real threat is a big threat. So there are quite a lot of myths in migration. One of the myths about migration is that migrants take people's jobs. In some segments they do, mostly they don't. Most of the migrants that we have today in Germany are not even allowed to work. And if they work, they often work in very low-wage segments. That is the first point. The second point, I guess, is it's extremely important to have transparent information about all kinds of things that are in line with migration. And that is what the real costs are compared to other things, what the real benefits are compared to other things. We come from a time where in Germany we weren't really willing to provide the public with transparent data on important things, where it's, this is not for you guys, we take care of it. And I think for a good debate, very good data, and the possibility of researchers to use these data and inform the public would be absolutely fundamental. This is, for me, the way that we can regain trust also in institutions and economic policy. Economic policy evaluation is so important, and we're not always doing it as systematic as other countries, for instance, the Scandinavian countries and so on. They simply have a better base of information, and that allows to spread misinformation, and misinformation spreads mistrust.
There we go. And I think that concludes our podcast for today. Guido, thank you so much for coming in and sharing your results, your research results with us. It was quite fascinating. And as we were saying, mind-boggling, counterintuitive, and on the verge of paradoxical. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
That concludes the 4th episode of ConTrust, the podcast on trust and conflict. Join us next time when we'll have more guests to discuss their fascinating research.